Hi everyone, it's Leela with Miss Kiss Creations. Welcome back to my channel and say hello to this Mr. Curious Onyx the cat. Today's tumbler tutorial, I'm going to show you how I created these mermaid tail glittered alcohol ink tumblers. I wanted to create something with a peekaboo and keep it very bright, but yet very simple and just delicate. And of course, always adding that glitter to the tumblers. Like always, all of my materials will be posted in my description below. And I also have my Amazon storefront ready to go. So I have a list of all the materials that I use on a daily basis for not only my tumblers, for all of my epoxy creations. And remember, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more tumbler and craft videos. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started with this tutorial. I'm starting with a 20-ounce stainless steel tumbler. I first sanded this tumbler down with the 180 grit sanding block all around the tumbler, making sure to get the very top and the bottom of the tumbler. Once I finished sanding down the tumblers with that sanding block, I went in with my 91% alcohol and I wiped away any of that excess oil or excess sanding dust. You can see how dark that sanding dust is on that tumbler. This is a very important step to this process. And then once that was wiped down, I went in with some flat spray paint. It doesn't have to be flat, I just used the flat because I had that on hand. Once that was dried, I am showing y'all all the materials that I'm using. I'm making sure to use 91% alcohol. I have some paint brushes, I have some makeup wedges that has already been used, so you can reuse those. And then here I am showing you all of the colors I'm placing on one of the tumblers. Both of the tumbler color alcohol inks will be listed in the description below, so don't worry about the color scheme or the names. So what I first do is I take some alcohol ink, just randomly placing around the tumbler and dabbing around the tumbler with that makeup wedge. This part is not going to look pretty, trust me y'all, and if it does, then I am super jealous because this part never looks pretty for me. So I am just placing each color one by one around that tumbler, and you can see that I'm switching out each of those makeup wedges only because I like to keep the same color on this the different wedges, I should say, so I don't mix the colors. And I'm placing these colors all around the tumbler and I'm trying to completely cover the entire tumbler. If you don't cover the entire tumbler, that's okay. I'm going to show y'all how I smooth out these hard lines and how I create that watercolor effect. So just keep applying those colors, and I will admit I probably add way too many colors than what I should. I just like it very vibrant and bright, so I just get carried away and I cover the entire tumbler with those inks. Here is the tumbler completely finished with those inks. You can see, not too pretty, right? But it's okay, we're going to make that beautiful using some 91% alcohol and a paintbrush. I just placed that 91% alcohol inside of a little tray, and then I dab that paintbrush with the alcohol, and then I just dab around, all around the tumbler, and I don't change my paintbrush. I just dab, and if the colors mix, then they mix. I use a lot of colors that complement each other, so if they do mix, then they create just a more beautiful color. Do keep in mind, I do this right after I apply those alcohol inks. I do not wait to go in with my 91% alcohol because these alcohol inks dry very quickly, so you can do this right after you applied all those inks to the tumbler. And you can already see all of those harsh lines are just smooshed together and they're just laid out. And now it's becoming that beautiful alcohol ink or watercolor effect, and it just blends so beautifully. I love this. You can see I'm just dabbing away all around the tumbler until my heart is happy. And the great thing about these is you don't have to seal this tumbler at all. You just let these alcohol inks air dry for about an hour, and then you go right in with epoxy. And you can see that pink tumbler that I did, it's more of a bright tumbler compared to the blue tumbler. And then once I've been letting those inks sit on the tumbler for about an hour, I went in with my epoxy. I used 10 milliliters of epoxy for this. I just want enough epoxy to seal in those inks. This is the first of many coats of epoxy, so I want to keep it thin. So again, for this 20-ounce stainless steel tumbler, I'm using 5 milliliters part A and 5 milliliters part B, totaling 10 milliliters of epoxy and then letting my epoxy cure on my tumbler until moving on to that next step. You want at least 24 hours curing time before moving on to our next step. And now both of my tumblers are cured. Look how beautiful both of these are. I love how different they turned out. I did have a little bit of bumps on both of the tumblers from the epoxy, but that's okay. Now what we're gonna do is we're going to take a sanding block, 180 grit sanding block, and sand away on these tumblers. You don't wanna sand too hard because you don't have a thick base over that stainless steel. So if you do sand too hard, then you might sand up some of that epoxy with alcohol inks and then your stainless steel might show. So just keep that in mind to sand very lightly. Once I was finished sanding those tumblers, I then took an X-Acto knife and I cleaned around the rim of both of those tumblers, removing any excess epoxy. Once I finished cutting all of those, or both of those tumblers with the X-Acto knife, I then took 180 grit sanding block and I sanded around both of those rims. Once I was finished sanding, I then took my 91% alcohol and I wiped down both of the tumblers. My next step was adding those mermaid tails to the tumblers. I am using a 631 or temporary vinyl, not permanent vinyl for these tumblers. And I'm also just using whichever color vinyl I had on hand. I will post the length and width of these tails on the screen here, so make sure you check that out. I wanted to make sure that they covered most of the tumblers and I didn't want small tails, so I wanted 2 tails coming from the top and the bottom of each tumbler. You want to make sure you're pressing down on those tails, making sure that that vinyl is completely stuck to that tumbler, so whenever we go to spray paint, no spray paint crawls underneath the bottom of those vinyl pieces. Again, just try to work with these tails as much as you can, and if you have any crinkles or wrinkles in the tails, then just don't worry about that because we're going to be removing these. This piece of vinyl is acting as a template, so this is just temporary, so we do not have to keep this on the tumbler for long. I placed that piece on the bottom and then I used an X-Acto knife and I cleaned that area up and I just traced around that circle around the bottom of the tumbler just to make it a little bit more clean and crisp. After I was finished placing these vinyl pieces on my tumbler, I went in with some white spray paint. I used flat. You can use whichever finish you like. I let the spray paint dry for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then once that was dried, I went in with all of these glitters on my tumblers. The glitters I'm using are all from Glitter Heart Co., and I will post all of these colors in my description below. I try to use very light and fun colors because I wanted those tails, that alcohol ink effect, to really pop and really just be vibrant on the tumbler. So I didn't want to have too much stuff going on the tumbler, so I wanted to keep it very simple. I'm applying all my glitter using the epoxy method, and this first tumbler was just so difficult for me. I realized the camera angle was horrible, so don't worry, I'm giving you a better camera angle for the next tumbler. But what I did was I just took my tumbler off of the turner and then I added that first color on top, and then I just went in with the next color in the middle and then the bottom color. Now do keep in mind, whenever I added that epoxy on my tumbler, I just focused on the areas that's going to have the glitter. So I didn't try to apply that epoxy to that vinyl area. Remember, that vinyl is going to be removed and that's acting as a template. So you'll see a lot of bare spaces or spots on the tumbler. That's all the spaces where that vinyl is. So that's why it looks a little choppy right now. And I also used my fast set epoxy. I do not recommend using fast set epoxy for this glitter process because I was rushing and I was going super fast and I was panicking. So I was just trying to get this done as quickly as possible so that epoxy did not cure on me and did not stick those vinyl pieces to the tumbler. And now you see me removing that vinyl immediately. Again, do not want that epoxy to dry. I want to get that vinyl off of the tumblers immediately. So I rip that vinyl up and then I clean it up with just a baby wipe if there's any epoxy that's sticking on top or any that may have dripped on that alcohol ink area. You can see how beautiful that is. So working on the next tumbler, adding the glitter, giving y'all a better angle. Again, adding that epoxy, not using the fast set epoxy, just using regular epoxy, and adding all of that epoxy around the tumbler area, not adding it or trying not to add it too much to those decals or vinyl areas. You can see I'm just dipping my finger in my epoxy and then adding that epoxy all around the tumbler. I used about 1 to 2 milliliters of epoxy for each tumbler for this step. So what I typically do is just make a batch of epoxy and then use some and then use the rest of epoxy for other projects. I'm first going in with my first color, which is the top color, my favorite color from Glitter Heart Co., which is Diamonds. And then I go in with my bottom color, and then I am just trying to go in with it and then adding that on the bottom with the tumbler angled. So you see how I have that tumbler angled and I'm focusing on the edge. All of that glitter just rolls right down that tumbler. And then I go in with that middle color and keeping the cap on and just kind of sprinkling that on the tumbler like salt. And then I go in with all the other colors and I clean up those areas. I really didn't overthink this ombre step, even if it wasn't as clean or as ombre as I wanted it to be. It turned out really beautiful, so don't overthink this step. I really think those mermaid tails and the alcohol ink is really what pops on these tumblers. And then removing those decals from your tumbler right after you applied that glitter to your tumblers. Make sure that you are doing this. You do not want your epoxy curing on your tumblers. If it does cure, then you're not going to be able to remove this vinyl. So I use my backwards tweezers, and that really did help to get those small areas that I couldn't get with my fingers. I then place both of these tumblers back on the turner and I let them spin for the appropriate amount of time, depending on if I use the fast set or the regular epoxy. So make sure your epoxy is cured. Once my epoxy was cured, I noticed that the bottom of my purple tumbler was a little messy. So I went in with some Mod Podge and I fanned some Mod Podge around the bottom of the tumbler, just cleaning up some of these spaces and making sure that I'm applying this very little amount of Mod Podge on the tumbler and then adding some glitter. So this helped clean up the bottom. You can see that it looks a lot better already. And then I took a dry paintbrush and I wiped away any of that excess glitter. I then went in with my Krylon Crystal Clear acrylic coating and I sprayed 3 generous coats of this coating. So I sprayed 1 coat, let it dry for 10 minutes, spray the next coat, 10-minute dry time, and then the 3rd coat. I wanted to make sure that I sprayed a lot of coats of the sealer to my tumblers because now we're going in with epoxy and I didn't want that glitter to go all inside of those tails. So I want to keep it that peekaboo effect. You can see I'm adding all of that epoxy all around the tumbler and I sprayed my epoxy all around the tumbler. I didn't just focus on the glitter area, I sprayed the entire tumbler with that sealer. For this step, I use about 20 milliliters of epoxy for each tumbler. So that's 10 milliliters part A and 10 milliliters part B, totaling 20 milliliters for each tumbler. So for both tumblers, the total amount of epoxy I used was 40 milliliters of epoxy. And then while that epoxy was still wet, I decided to go in with some chunky glitters for each tumbler. I wanted something else on these tumblers and I thought these glitters would look beautiful with them. So I used a light blue from Glitter Heart Co. and then a purple from Glitter Heart Co. for the purple tumbler. And these glitters, they have little pieces of silver in them. So I really thought this is what I needed to give it that extra pop. Once I was finished with applying this glitter, I then let my tumblers spin on the cup turner for 4 hours. I then turn off my cup turners and I let my tumblers air dry or air cure for another 20 hours. My total drying time of 24 hours. And now that these tumblers are cured, I'm going in with a 220 grit sanding block and I'm sanding away around these tumblers, I don't want to sand too hard and sand away any of the glitter, but I just want to sand away any of those bumps or any of that glitter pieces that may have been sticking through that epoxy. So make sure you're giving a real nice sanding, and then I'm going in with my X-Acto knife again. Remember, I try to do this every time I epoxy, just making sure that I'm getting rid of any of that excess epoxy that's cured on the rim. I try to do this because if I don't, then at the very end of the tumbler, I have a lot of epoxy on the rim and it takes a lot of arm work to remove that epoxy. And then going in and sanding that rim one more time, and then wiping down with 91% alcohol before we add the final coat of epoxy to the tumblers. With the final coat of epoxy, I used about 15 milliliters of epoxy per tumbler. You can use 10 to 20 to be honest. So I used about 7.5 of part A and then 7.5 of part B, totaling 15 milliliters of epoxy per tumbler. So both of the tumblers together, I used 30 milliliters of epoxy. I then let those tumblers again spin on the cup turner for 4 hours, and then air dry or air cure for another 20 hours with a total drying time of 24 hours. Once my tumblers were completely cured, I then went in with a final time with my X-Acto knife and cleaning up the rim of the tumbler, removing any of that excess epoxy. Once I cleaned the rim of the tumbler, I then went in with some 91% alcohol just to remove any of that alcohol ink that may have been inside of the tumbler. And then I use 100% acetone to remove any of that excess paint inside of the tumbler. You can always use some painter's tape and add that inside of the tumbler once you spray paint your tumblers, but honestly, I never do. And then I wash the inside of the tumblers with Dawn dish soap. If you need more assistance with how to clean up the rim, I do have a help tutorial in my description below. And both of these tumblers are completely finished. These are so beautiful and they're going to be so hard to let go. Let me know which one you like better, and if you did enjoy this video, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more tumbler and craft videos. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.